Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna-Marie Curran, and I'm a partner in the EU and competition team of A&L Goodbody. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on developments in agri-food supply chains. Over the next hour or so, we'll be discussing regulatory developments in the agri-food sector and sharing insights and experiences from the first 2 years since the Unfair Trade Practices Directive was implemented into Irish law. We're delighted to be joined today by the Agri-Food Regulator, Niamh Lenehan, who will be in conversation with my colleague, Damien Ryan, on enforcement of the Unfair Trade Practices regulations and the regulator's role in market studies and data analysis. We'll also be joined online by Professor Thia Hennessy of University College Cork, who will be familiar to many of you working in this sector. By way of context, the agri-food sector has faced significant cost inflation and supply chain disruption in recent years, as well as increasing demands for greater transparency and sustainability. Against that backdrop, Ireland has established a dedicated, independent regulatory function focused on ensuring fairness and transparency in the agri-food supply chain. Of course, this is just not unique to Ireland. Since the adoption of the Unfair Trade Practices Directive in 2019, EU member states have intensified their focus on the sector, with over 4,500 investigations opened between 2021 and 2024 by national regulators, with approximately 42 million euros in fines imposed for UTP infringements. At EU level, legislative proposals are advancing to strengthen cooperation between national enforcement authorities, in particular with regard to information sharing and cross-border investigations. Alongside enforcement, we are seeing increased market analysis. For example, only yesterday, Italy's competition authority launched a new wide-ranging market study into the food industry in Italy, focusing in particular on an apparent disconnect between rising prices in the sector and the general rate of inflation, with a public consultation running until the end of January. During today's webinar, we will explore how our regulator intends to use her legislative tools to promote fair trade practices in Ireland. From a practical perspective, we know that businesses need clarity on the enforcement approach, and that enforcement must be both targeted and proportionate. We'll examine what the regulator expects from businesses in practice and what transparency really means for data and price reporting. We'll also touch on how the regulator's role aligns with competition law and consumer protection, and how those legislative frameworks can and should complement each other. Just a brief word on our two guest speakers. Niamh Lenehan leads Ireland's agri-food regulatory function with a mandate to promote fairness and transparency across the supply chains. She brings deep public policy and market experience to the role and has been closely engaged with stakeholders as the regulatory framework has taken shape. We're very grateful to Niamh for joining us here today at what is a particular busy time for her office. Professor Thia Hennessy is the head of the College of Business and Law at University College Cork and is a member of the university's leadership team. She's a highly cited economist with an extensive publication record on the economic performance of the agri-food sector, and she's a distinguished track record in academia and organisational leadership. We very much look forward to hearing Professor Hennessy's insights. We'll begin with a one-to-one discussion with the regulator to frame the key issues. Then we'll hear commentary from Professor Hennessy before opening the floor to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time through the Q&A function, and you have the option of putting those questions in anonymously. So please feel free to ask questions. With that, I'll now hand you over to Damien.
Niamh, I also want to extend my thanks for joining us today. You're more than welcome, and we do appreciate you taking the time because we do know you're busy. I just want to start by asking you about the mandate that the Agri-Regulator has. And in particular, do you think there's a good understanding among the public and among retailers and other stakeholders as to your function, the things you've been tasked with doing as the Agri-Food Regulator?
Well, thanks so much, Damien. Good afternoon to everybody. Delighted to be here to talk about the role of the regulator and I suppose the benefits for everyone. And I suppose in terms of your question, I mean, there is a road to go in terms of raising awareness and understanding of the regulator's role in the supply chain. And just to expand on that a small bit, we just celebrated our second birthday. At Christmas there, or just before Christmas. So thank you. A busy 2 years and lots to come. But it is a relatively short period of time. Yeah. So although the office was long awaited, you know, there were different changes in the as it went through the legislative process to establish the office. So, I mean, why are we here? And I suppose it's important to say that at a higher level, it's about promoting fairness and transparency in our supply chain. That's important for all of us because we all want to eat, we all want to have security for our food, etc. And we're a big exporting nation and all that sort of thing. So with that in mind, and the fact that the stakeholders, or our stakeholders of the regulator, are very diverse. So they include all businesses along the supply chain. We have a particular focus on business to business interactions. So what exactly then are we required to do, or what have we been asked to do? Well, one is to implement the Unfair Trading Practice Directive, and that's an EU directive, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But essentially, there are 16 specific practices that are considered unfair and that we must oversee compliance with, in a nutshell. And then we're asked to provide or publish information on price and market analysis to increase transparency. And I suppose those two functions are in the context that there are information imbalances or power imbalances along the supply chain. So there are larger businesses and smaller suppliers, if you like, smaller suppliers and larger buyers. And the purpose is to try and protect some of the smaller, more vulnerable businesses in the supply chain.
Well, as you say, I mean, information is key. And in order for you to get that information, there needs to be some engagement with the companies that have it. Now, I know that there are certain companies that are obliged to engage with you, compliance reporting buyers, and perhaps that group is about to get bigger given your new powers, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But more broadly speaking, how has engagement been with your office since its inception?
Damien, very good. So in early 24, we set out on the road, I suppose, and one of the first things, and I think it has come across very strongly in terms of our first strategy for the first 3 years, 24 to 26, that we're putting a huge emphasis on stakeholder engagement, and quite rightly. So this is relatively new for everybody. Yeah. And the unfair trading practices were in a year or so before the regulator got started, but even so, that's relatively new. And we know there's going to be changes at EU level, and it's being evaluated at the moment. So but just, I know we'll probably talk about that as well, but I mean, the price and market analysis function was new as well. And, you know, how that was going to work, etc., was of interest to all the businesses along the supply chain. So we set out quite early to engage, and the reaction has been very good. People have given us lots of time and insight, etc. And we've been very proactive in terms of communicating our strategy and the general approach, which is a very, very collaborative approach with everybody. Yeah. On the unfair trading practices side, or the regulatory side, if you want to call it that, we have been very much supporting compliance, and I think that's an essential part of the role. And, you know, there is enforcement as well, obviously, but the approach that we take is one of lots of partnership and collaboration, and that has obviously been the case on the price and market analysis side as well.
So as you say, it's a key function of the regulator to police and to enforce the unfair trading regulations, which is an EU directive, which is transposed into Irish law. Now, the way that applies, and in particular the way it's been transposed into Irish law, it's very, very broad. So a buyer who purchases agricultural goods, and agricultural goods is not just food. I mean, it includes plants. It includes an awful lot of agricultural products. The very fact that they purchase them and that they have a turnover which is larger than the supplier which sells them means that they're caught by the unfair trading regulations. And if that buyer has a turnover in excess of 50 million, then there's an obligation to submit a report to you annually. And I know a lot of the people watching this webinar will have been part of that reporting process. The first such reports were submitted in March of last year. So now that your office has had an opportunity to go through the first of those reports, are there some learning points from going through those reports? Things maybe that you would like to share, some initial thoughts you have, having had a look at them and having gone through the process?
Sure. Thanks, Damien. I think if I certainly will, and just for viewers as well, I might break it down a small bit in terms of this is an EU directive and there's 16 specific unfair trading practices. And those practices, Ireland transposed that directive as a minimum. So we have those 16 rules, but other EU countries could have different rules and more rules on top of that as well. So what we have done is that we have those 16 specific unfair trading practices, and essentially they try and protect smaller suppliers from larger buyers. So the access to that protection for against unfair trading practices is if the supplier is smaller in turnover than the buyer, and the buyer has at least 2 million turnover. So that is the basic access to the protection for a supplier. So then we move on to when the regulator was established in December 2023, the minister at that time introduced revised regulations, or the 2023 regulations, if you want to call it that. And those regulations brought into place a practical framework, I suppose, for helping the regulator oversee compliance with the unfair trading practices. And amongst that, you quite rightly mentioned this concept of a compliance reporting buyer. So a compliance reporting buyer is a business that is established in the state that buys agri-food products and that has at least a 50 million turnover in the previous year. And if that is the case, that business must supply what the regulations call an annual compliance report to the regulator. And those reports, the first reports were due in March last year, March 25. So the date remains the same. It's a legislative date of the 31st of March each year. And the report that must be submitted relates to the previous year. So during that year, essentially how the business oversaw compliance, and there are further details about, perhaps products returned, promotional activity. So there are there's a specific template that we worked or that we consulted with businesses on in order to do that. And as you quite rightly said as well, the definition of agri-food, or the products that are covered, are very, very extensive. So they cover everything that we eat, if you like, which is relatively straightforward.
Can I just ask you, Niamh, because I think a key point with it is that it's to protect a weaker supplier.
Yes.
And in that sense, there is somewhat of an anomaly in the framework, in that a supplier is deemed to be weaker if they have a smaller turnover than the buyer. Now, that supplier might have turnover of billions, but nevertheless, it's deemed to be weaker. It's also the case the turnover is just the company's turnover. So the fact that a small proportion relates to agri-foods is actually irrelevant for the purposes of the 50 million threshold. So if it's a service station or if it's an airline, the fact that that's not actually how they make their money is not relevant as long as the turnover hits 50 million. And I'm just wondering, that was a bit of a surprise, I know, to some companies. And I wonder, is that recognized as something that's slightly anomalous? And is there potentially going to be a change to the regulation there?
Yeah, I think when the 2023 regulations came in, the way they are written is that, as I said, if the business is established in the state and buys agri-food products, which, as we were saying, can be quite extensive to trees, cut flowers, as well as food products, if you like, and if there's a turnover of over 50 million, you are a compliance reporting buyer. So that the majority of that turnover need not be from agri-food.
Yeah.
So the focus, if you like, or the main focus of the business could actually be something else. And the buying and selling or whatever of agri-food could be a small part. As you quite rightly say, that business still falls under the remit of or still falls in scope of the regulations. What I would say is that, the team at the regulator have been very extensive in their efforts in terms of identifying businesses, answering any questions people have. And as I said, we worked on a template which has been based on feedback from businesses last year. We've amended to try and reduce insofar as possible the admin burden, etc. On businesses. But certainly what we're seeing is that for most businesses, completing the template is relatively straightforward. There are, of course, businesses that maybe sell a lot of products. So there's big retailers and wholesalers that probably have to answer a lot of the questions on the form, if you like, and other businesses not so much. So I would say that one of the important things is, and one of the learnings you actually asked me about, learnings there from the first time round with these reports. And the learnings pretty much are that, it's important to pick up the phone. So a lot of businesses have come to us saying, look, I perhaps was afraid to pick up the phone or whatever up to now. And they were delighted that, they maybe interpreted a question one way and we meant another way and etc. So there has been a huge amount of learning on our side in terms of how the supply chain works. And as I said, we're committed to making it as simple as possible to comply, because that's our job, to support compliance. But I would very much say to businesses, look, pick up the phone. If you think you're a compliance reporting buyer, because that's important.
I know that the purpose of the reports, or one of the purposes of the report, was to inform which companies you choose to audit, basically, and where you might potentially carry out an inspection. Is it the case that when you look at these compliance reporting report submissions and you see, well, this is not really a case where you have a weak producer and a very strong buyer, it might be an agreement which actually has a multiplicity of risk factors like foreign exchange fluctuations, cost of transport fluctuations, commodity prices going up and down, and where the aspects of the black terms and the grey terms, the conditional, unconditional prohibitions, are actually ancillary to those agreements, that you think to yourself, that's not really where we're going to direct our resources in order to carry out an audit?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's an important question as well, or comment. We have been using these compliance reports to do what it says on the tin, which is to help us oversee compliance with the regulations. So they have certainly, as I said, there's lots of learning from our side about how the supply chain works. And of course, there's different nuances in different sectors, and that's important to understand as well. They are being used to feed into broader risk assessment framework in terms of where we direct our resources in terms of actual visits, inspection visits. And we are ramping that up. We have additional sanctioned staff, so we will have additional teams on the ground. But what I would say is that the reports, and obviously through liaising with businesses for the past 2 years, they are important for businesses as well, and in terms of harnessing them. And what I mean by that is that they should use the reports, and are using the reports, to inform what's happening in their business in terms of the unfair trading practices, and to make sure that there is awareness of them as in all aspects of the business, because there are, and I suppose, you know, we're assuming that people are very familiar with the 16 practices. So I think you made reference to there are 10 that are prohibited in all circumstances, and they include, for example, paying for perishable products within generally 30 days. There's also one, for example, about not unilaterally changing a supply contract. So changing, you know, perhaps the frequency or the location or amount of a supply. But that you also have one there which I would highlight about commercial retaliation. So, you know, it's important, and that could be the actions of a particular person or a particular buyer. So it's very important, and businesses have been leveraging the report in terms of informing themselves, and the regulations do call for a business to actively monitor their compliance with the unfair trading practices. And I think it's probably important to say as well that, you know, where a business is trading across borders, as I said at the start or alluded to, there can be differences in terms of the practices that some of the countries have in place, because they can go further to what we have here.
No, that's definitely true, and hopefully in a while we'll talk about the EU dimension. And then even separate to the reports themselves, for the smaller companies, you had the retail and wholesale voluntary survey that you conducted. I saw the headline that came out of that was that 14% of suppliers identified potentially an unfair trading practices as part of their agreement. Now, I mean, my general sense of the report was that non-compliance was not that high, and yet that seemed to be what came out of the voluntary survey. Is the voluntary survey something you're going to repeat? And if it was, is it something you would do differently were you to do it again?
Well, certainly, I'm not sure whose headline that was, but in terms of the supplier survey, so just for viewers, what the survey is a survey of suppliers into our very significant retail and wholesale businesses. So there are 8 businesses in total that we worked with last year, and when we ran the inaugural survey. And so what suppliers are being asked to do is provide feedback on their trading experiences for the year and for the previous year. And that includes, obviously, we're asking questions about UTPs or any perceived or alleged instance of UTPs, but also other issues that they're experiencing to kind of give a holistic view of the trading in that year. So the way we have gone about that is that we are working in partnership with those businesses in terms of we've asked them to send the links to their own suppliers, and certainly we have gotten very, very good feedback in terms of that. And again, businesses using the survey to inform what's happening in their business, or training and etc., or highlighting things that they might look at. And again, you know, we hope to do this on an annual basis. This year's survey will go live next Wednesday, so I would encourage people to look out for that. And certainly it is also being used on our side to inform the possible development of guidelines. So we do have a function under our legislation to publish guidelines for buyers for the purpose of protecting supplier interests. So they wouldn't be statutory guidelines.
Can I ask you about the market analysis that you do? So that's obviously a separate function that the regulator has. And I see you've been producing these price dashboards, which monitor the price of certain commodities in the sector.
Sure.
But what purpose is the regulator going to pursue when you carry out these market studies and look into these particular sector, gathering all this information? What is going to be the output?
Yeah. No, it's really useful. And I think this is where, going back to what you perhaps were alluding to earlier on, in terms of, understanding what the regulator is trying to do and remit that it's given. So this price and market analysis function, if you like, was given to us upon establishment, and it's new. And what we've been asked to do is publish analysis of information about price and market data. And so we set out on the road, as I said, and talked to lots of businesses along the supply chain. And what we're trying to do is add more information into the operation of the supply chain. So
does it have like a political dimension? So, for example, when Mercosur comes in, is it your office who will be carrying out a study to see if there was any distortion in prices of agricultural products in Ireland?
I mean, that may be a long time down the road in terms of if there. I mean, the office may be involved at some stage in looking at impacts or whatever. But really, I suppose what we've been focusing on to date is getting more information on those parts of the supply chain where perhaps there hasn't been a lot of information to date. So, for example, there is relatively lots more information at a primary producer level. So the Department of Agriculture, for example, Teagasc, lots of different bodies in the landscape are producing information in terms of that phase of our supply chain. We all know what we pay for milk and bread and whatever else when we go
That's an important point. So if you identified a shift in a price in a commodity, an input, and that was going down, but the corresponding consumer product on the shelf, the price of that wasn't going down, is that somewhere then where you might start an investigation into a particular sector or a study into a particular sector, just to shed light on it?
Yeah, so it's not an investigation in the sense of, there would be an investigation, say, for example, into the breach of a UTP. But what our role is to look at or help shed light on price formation mechanisms as it goes through the supply chain. So, as I was saying, if we're looking at it, so the approach that we've taken, that might be the best way of looking at it, is that we've looked at different primary production sectors to date. So we've looked at eggs, horticulture, dairy, into beef as well. And what we've been, and we have dashboards in those areas. So essentially what we wanted to do was look at price formation as we go along the supply chain, so first of all, looking at what's publicly available, and looking to bring that together in an easily accessible way. So we know that there's...
Using your new powers, I presume.
Well, the new powers, yeah, I might talk about that. It's kind of separate to what we've been doing to date, but we have been looking at the publicly available information, bringing that together, and what we were hoping to do when we started off was that we would supplement that with information available from businesses, so that we would get information from businesses, aggregate it as appropriate, and produce information for a general audience, if you like, and particularly to help smaller businesses that may not have access to the same information. So what the new regulations have done, and what you're referring to are the 2025 regulations, if you want to call it that, the ones that Minister Hayden has signed in December last. And essentially what that has done is it will allow the regulator to compel the provision of information on price and market data from businesses. The power that we had upon establishment was the power to seek. And we've gone through a process, and we have been, I suppose, very transparent about how that has gone. So we looked at the egg sector, into the horticulture sector, and unfortunately not all of the businesses that was asked to provide information did provide it. And again, there has been lots of engagement, but unfortunately, not all businesses provided the information. So that has led to the new powers, if you like. But I think one thing that's really, really important to say is that it remains, and those new regulations, the Compel part, if you like, are effective from the end of this year, from the 31st of December. But I think what's really important is that the approach of the regulator hasn't changed, in the sense that we still wish to work with businesses and collaborate with businesses on providing information. So businesses are free to provide on a voluntary basis the information and liaise with
the
us.
role of the office is clearly evolving. And it was interesting, Anna-Marie mentioned at the very outset how the Italian Competition Authority had launched an investigation into the agri sector in Italy only yesterday. And in France, over the last year, there has been an ongoing investigation into buyer alliances. So basically supermarkets, retail outlets in France who are grouped together and then have a market power to face producers and potentially exert that market power. Whereas I notice in Ireland, there seems to be a very clear separation between the Competition Authority and the Agri-Regulator. I wonder, do you see the Agri-Regulator and the Competition Authority potentially working together in the future? I mean, I know the statute does provide for a sharing of information to a certain extent, and to working alongside the Competition Authority if you wanted to. Is it something that you've started to do or that you might intend doing?
Yeah, I mean, we have met with the CCPC, have a good relationship with them, but the functions are distinct, as you know. So the CCPC are obviously looking from a competition context, and what the regulator is, as I've said, trying to improve transparency and trying to improve the level of information that's generally available. And as I said, we have those dashboards that are a first step in terms of improving transparency in those sectors, and we intend to look at others and build, of course, on them in partnership with businesses. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I do know is that there are, as you say, it's a rapidly evolving space, I think. You know, for example, the UTP Directive has been the evaluation, the first evaluation of that directive took place through the Commission, European Commission, and the report was published in early December. And right now there is a public consultation on the experiences of businesses along the supply chain with the unfair trading practices. So the Commission is going to use that feedback in terms of informing what changes might be taking place or might be made to the regulation. So
one change that we know might be taking place, because you mentioned the European Commission, is that there's a proposal for a regulation for a coordinated enforcement across the European Union. And it's one of the reasons why I mentioned other member states, because you now will be working with your counterparts in other member states. And when I saw that proposal, I thought, well, I wonder, is the thinking that there needs to be consistency, so that you're both interpreting, you and your counterparts in other member states, the same rules in the same way? Or is it more a coordinated enforcement approach, such that a company that might have a trading entity here in Dublin and then might have a trading entity in Madrid or Paris or Milan, and they would find themselves subject to enforcement where Dublin is coordinating with one of these European cities against a particular company. So as I say, is it more the consistency approach or is it a more of a coordinated enforcement approach?
I think it's both. So in terms of what you're referring to is every member state must have an enforcement authority. And obviously we're the Irish one, and there is a network that meets every year, at least once a year, in terms of the enforcement across borders. So the regulations, there are new regulations expected in terms of cooperation across borders. And that was actually agreed by the Commission late last year, and it does need to go through the Council and the Parliament now. But it is expected that these will come in. And essentially, in a nutshell, what they are doing is that they are providing an enhanced framework for cooperation between the enforcement authorities. So the original directive always envisaged contact and coordination to help oversee and enforce the UTP regulations across borders. But I think, as you've probably alluded to there, maybe different approaches, different rules in each country. So this is trying to bring together a very practical framework. So, I mean, it is envisaged that it would facilitate increased cooperation across borders to tackle some of the issues that you're speaking of there. So businesses are trading across borders. There are different rules, regulations, etc. And it's important to be able to share information. So these regulations are basically enhancing the framework for doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see from this, you clearly have a very, very wide mandate and a lot to do in 2026. I wonder if we might pause there and ask Professor Thia Hennessy, who is kindly joining us from UCC. Thia, as Anna Marie's already done an introduction, but an eminent agri-economist. So, Thia, I wonder, having listened to Niamh's interview, if there were any initial thoughts or observations just from what you've heard over the course of the last 30 minutes or so.
Absolutely. Thanks, Damien, and I really enjoyed listening to your contribution, Niamh. It's great to see the regulator up in its second year, or going into its third year. I think it was long awaited, and there are great expectations, I suppose, in terms of what it can deliver, and it's good to see the legislative powers coming through as well. I learned a lot about the compliance reporting aspect of the regulator, because it really wasn't something I was that familiar with, and it'll be really interesting to see how that will take effect as time goes on and the impact it'll have. I would have been much more familiar with the remit around transparency and data reporting and the push to get more data published by different actors along the supply chain. And I do think that's a very important role. I think when consumer prices are high in the supermarket and when food inflation is running higher than inflation more generally in the economy, consumers tend to think, and it's often fueled by the media, that something unfair is happening along the supply chain. And equally, when prices are low at the primary producer level, farmers tend to look at, where the profit is being absorbed. And as long as there is an information vacuum in that, entirety of the supply chain, there will be suspicion that something unfair is happening. So I think to be able to move to filling some of those gaps and requiring the publication of data, especially say from some of the international retailers, and that it'll fill the information gap. I don't think it'll solve any problems or change anything in particular in terms of the actions, but at least it gives people the transparency, the information and the confidence to understand what's happening, and will probably prompt new questions and different questions that may come back as a future remit of the regulator. I think the international part is really important as well. Obviously, we export so much of what we produce within the EU. It is such a huge impact on the final primary producer price. We import such a big impact on our consumer price. So without an all of EU approach, it's difficult to see how we can make progress. But I would also say, there's the beyond the EU, there's the trade into the UK, the trade beyond Europe and the implications that has on pricing as well, and perhaps where the regulations aren't as strict. Just to bear that in mind. Thanks, Damien.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Thea, I think you pick up on an important point there when you reference the media, because when you look at a lot of headlines, they create a direct link between the work of the regulator and then the prices of food on the shelf and the inflation of those prices. Whereas that assumes, I mean, that we're a closed economy and that, well, first of all, that the regulator has some control over increases, some direct control over increases in prices, but also ignores the fact, I mean, we're a net exporter of agri-food products. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, if we're looking at the prices at the primary level, we're a net exporter. We're completely exposed to what's happening on world markets, which in turn is exposed to natural events like climate-related events, animal disease. All of those things affect the supply of products. And even a very small percentage change in the supply can have a very dramatic effect on the market when demand is relatively constant. And all of those things will continue to affect the primary producer price. And then there's all the cost of processing, the cost of transport, and when we look beyond the Eurozone, the exchange rates as well. And I mean, I think some of those things are often conveniently overlooked when we look at how prices rise and fall. And then from a consumer's perspective, I think the media is often suggesting that when prices increase, that those increases are passed very quickly to the consumer. But when commodity prices fall, that the consumer price doesn't fall as quickly. There has been a lot of academic research done on that, and there's nothing to prove that to be true. They say that both price increases and decreases pass through at the same rate, but there is a lag. And the reason there is a lag is because most of the people on the line will know that in business, you have a lot of fixed price contracts, you have a lot of long-term contracts, and prices within those contracts don't move, in tandem with real market prices. And that's why you have that lag, but there's nothing to prove that lag is longer on a downward trend than it is on an upward one.
So that being the case then, and us being exposed as a very open economy, nevertheless, there is a broad remit afforded to the Agri-Food Regulator, and clearly there's government is behind the body. The regulator has recently got new powers of compulsion. How would you anticipate the regulator having an impact on the agri-food sector in Ireland?
So I do think the information sharing part is really important, as we said, because I do think it will deliver information where it hasn't been previously. I think the compliance reporting in particular, maybe beyond the primary consumer or producer, maybe the smaller processing companies and the SME sector in particular, will give them a lot more confidence in dealing with large buyers and suppliers. And I just think that element of fairness within the supply chain and the focus on that. But again, I think the coordination across the EU will be very interesting to see how that develops as well, because I do think, given how open our economy is, that really is crucial.
Niamh, sorry, I don't know if you have any comments on what Thia has said.
Yeah, thanks, Damien, and thanks, Thia. I think it's an evolving. The organisation needs to evolve, and I think one thing that's important to say, and I think I did touch on it earlier. I mean, it's not the Agri-Food Regulator that's going to improve fairness and transparency by itself. It's in collaboration with everyone along the supply chain for the benefit of all, because the regulator is an independent body, as I said, so all of its stakeholders are along the supply chain. And I would say also, just to get it in here as well, is that we are moving into our next strategy. So for 27 to 29, the regulator will be developing its strategy statement this year for that 3-year period, which coincidentally coincides with the effective date of the new regulations. And we will be consulting on that strategy, and I think that's important for viewers to know as well, that they will have an opportunity to feed into our strategy, and we very much want to hear from people.
Thank you. Thanks, Niamh. I'm being told that we do have some questions. Niamh, if you're happy to take questions. So has the regulator followed up with buyers on any of the buyer compliance reports that were submitted in 2025? So I guess following the submission of the reports, has there been dialogue or engagement? Have there been things you weren't happy with? Has there been any contact with the buyers that have submitted reports?
Yeah, I mean, in general, there has been lots of interaction, because with compliance reporting buyers, there must be a liaison officer established. So obviously, we're very anxious to be building up the relationships with the liaison officers, which we have been doing, and obviously the usual updates and everything. Particularly in terms of the reports, yes, there have. So when obviously we were encouraging people to be picking up the phone if they had any issues, and certainly we've been working to increase or improve and enhance and add to the frequently asked questions on our website. So they have been done based on the feedback from buyers.
And they're very helpful.
Good. Yeah, thank you for saying that. And they have been informed by people that have been in touch with us. Also, and I think I touched on it earlier, the template. So businesses had wanted a template, which I think is quite right, for the report. That template has been tweaked for this year. So for those falling in underneath a compliance reporting buyer banner for this year, that has been tweaked based on the feedback from buyers. So that's really important to know, because we wanted to make it, and are very committed to making it as easy as possible for everyone. So, like in terms of us getting back to buyers as well, yeah, of course there has been some back and forth where maybe there was a different interpretation taken or whatever. So hopefully that will have all added to the understanding for this year. And again, it's a call out and action to that, if there are buyers out there and that you're not clear if you're a compliance reporting buyer, if you have particular questions, please get in touch, because I mean that it is a requirement, and it'll make it easier on everybody if you come forward, and we're happy to talk through anything.
So we've a question on resource. How well resourced is the regulator to undertake these new powers? Is additional budget and/or recruitment required and forthcoming?
Well, I probably always say that budget people are required. Yeah, look, I mean
from the minister.
Yeah. The new regulations were signed on the 16th of December, so we had them when everyone else had them, and we're working through those, giving them careful consideration. I mean, the idea is that we need to be ready to go when they're effective at the end of this year, and I think, look, that I said earlier, we have gotten in or we have gotten sanction for more staff this year. We'll possibly be needing more. But
how many people currently are in the office?
We have 17 with sanction for another 5. So we are working on that, and we have an increase in the budget this year as well. So I mean, we are working through the processes and procedures and getting in place what we need to get in place to be in a position to go and to be able to implement the new regulations. I think it's important to repeat what I said earlier. I mean, the approach, the preferred approach here, is that businesses would be coming and working in collaboration with us, because that's certainly what the approach, what I want the approach to be, and what the approach of the regulator has been to date. So, businesses are free to come and talk to us and engage and provide information. And, there are safeguards there, obviously, in the Act, never mind the new regulations, about commercially sensitive data and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, so we will, I mean, the intention is that we'll be ready to go, or we have to be ready to go in terms of when the regulations are effective. So there's a long way to go yet, and who knows what resources we'll need going forward.
So we have another question. Are there any anticipated changes in the Irish agri-regs in light of recent EU-level discussion on turnover threshold calculations and supplier protections? So by Irish agri-regs, I presume the person means the unfair trading regulations, and the recent EU-level discussion, I'm guessing, is the report that was published just before Christmas. There was some doubt cast over whether having the threshold the way it currently is, where it's irrelevant just how big the supplier is, along as the supplier is smaller than the buyer, how effective that was in introducing fairness into the supply chain. Or at least that was my recollection of reading that report. I don't want to cut across this person's question, of course. But...
Yeah, so I mean, the UTP Directive itself has turnover thresholds, categories. So the supplier and the buyer, to make, to kind of make it simpler here, it had to be in different thresholds. So when the new regulations were brought in for UTPs in late 23, those thresholds were removed, and the access to protections for the supplier was if the supplier was smaller in turnover than the buyer, as I said, and that the buyer was at least 2 million. So there are different approaches throughout Europe as well. So in some cases, there is a restriction in terms of the supplier. So if the supplier is, say,
350 million,
350 million, yeah, they don't have they're considered big and bold enough or whatever, and they don't have the protections. I mean, there's no, I suppose, just to answer that person directly, though, there is no changes as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we're the Department of Agriculture is the policy lead on this, so would be looking at the legislation. If they were looking at it, I mean, it's highly unlikely, I would say, in terms of, I mean, the directive has been evaluated, and as I said, the Commission is now looking at a consultation in terms of informing any.
Because Ireland doesn't need to amend the Act. I mean, the Act provides that ministerial order can amend the rules. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it could make some stronger, for example. So some countries have, those conditional or grey UTPs that are only prohibited if not expressly agreed between a buyer and supplier in advance. And the example of those are, payments for marketing or whatever. So yes, so some countries have, for example, made some those grey ones back. So having them prohibited in all circumstances. So I mean, it would seem to me that
no changes in the pipeline at present.
Not that I'm aware of, and I mean, given that there is so much work going on at EU level, I think it's likely, or perhaps even, given at this stage, that the discussions on any changes to the UTP Directive will actually take place during the Irish presidency, later this year.
Something to look to. So next question, has the regulator considered the potential impact on Ireland's agri-food sector if large multinational buyers were to restructure their purchasing operations within the EU in response to regulatory changes? This is a very interesting question, I think, and a topic perhaps we would love to explore maybe at greater length, because I think there's always a risk that you would find one member state in competition with another member state to have a more accommodating regulatory structure with one eye on industrial policy. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Is there a risk that you would have a company which is established in Ireland, but is actually just the buying entity within a multinational? It might be buying outside the European Union for delivery to a different member state within the European Union, but that the entity is here because maybe for tax purposes, whatever other purposes, it's common law jurisdiction, it's English speaking, whatever other reasons, they're comfortable being here. but that would change if the regulatory obstacles became such that it was uncomfortable and that it was more comfortable for that company to be in Milan or Madrid or Tallinn.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I understand the question and why it's been asked, and I think that is something that has come up, I'm sure, in policy discussions, and it's a very large question. However, I mean, at this moment in time, and basically what we are, I mean, we have been given these regulations, so it's not, I mean, the regulator does have the power to make recommendations on legislative change to the minister, and that's a broad function, if you like, in terms of if we saw that there was issues or challenges or whatever in any aspect of the rules and regulations that we've been given, we could, that remains available to us. I mean, I think it's very early as well in terms of some of these things, but again, I mean, we have been given these regulations to implement, and that's where we are at the moment. I mean, we're implementing them, and it's early days.
Thanks, Steve. Maybe just one final question then. So will the regulator carry out the next retail supplier survey using the new powers to compel disclosure, or will it again be a voluntary survey that retailers can decline to be part of? So this is the retail wholesale voluntary survey that you completed, and I think there were some retailers that didn't want to engage in it. But of course now you're equipped with new powers to compel engagement.
Yeah.
I guess that's what the viewer is getting to.
Thanks, Damien, and thanks to the person for the question. I actually think it highlights just maybe, and it was my oversight in terms of not explaining it properly, but the supplier survey that we've been doing is voluntary. And will remain so, in terms of we are doing the survey, or conducting the survey, but we have asked and will continue to be asking the businesses to cooperate with us in terms of sending out the link and highlighting it to their suppliers. And
the information is coming in from the supplier, not the retailer.
It's been going very, very well, and look, we appreciate all the effort that the businesses are putting in, because they're really getting behind us and helping us out and leveraging it themselves as well. However, and that's very distinct from the new powers to compel. So the power to compel is specifically on the price and market analysis side. And it is that power to compel. It follows. It follows a whole process of going out and engaging, and one of the preconditions is engaging, as we have been doing to date, on any information requests that we send out. So any compelling would have to have been a follow on from a voluntary request and quite rightly engagement with the businesses. So they're very, very distinct pieces of work.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Niamh. We might go back to Anna Marie for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Damien, and thank you, Niamh. I hate to say it, but and pardon the pun, but there's lots of food for thought there in what was just heard over the last hour. Just some very quick highlights for me on the compliance reporting. I mean, we've been saying it to clients all along, but the scope of the obligation to report is quite broad. Anybody buying agri-food products and with a turnover of 50 million established in Ireland, they have to to produce these compliance reports. So just to be aware of that. But we've heard from the regulator that they're taking quite a pragmatic, open door approach to this. So if you have any questions, I think that there's an open door policy there. On the enforcement, I think looking to what's coming down the line, you know, particularly having regard to what we've seen on the competition side of things, there's a lot of cooperation between the CCPC and the European Competition Network, and investigations often get started as a result of what's happening in other member states. So I would say to businesses, you know, who have operations in other countries and they're seeing things from other regulators in other countries, just to be aware of that. There's going to be this greater coordination between regulators and enforcers throughout the EU. We're going to see probably much more focus in Ireland on those issues. And then finally, just on the new powers and the market analysis, it is good to hear that there is going to continue to be a kind of a cooperative approach taken by the regulator, but it's only where there's a need to compel that will take place. And these powers, of course, are not going to come into effect until after 31st of December this year, because there's a year to get them up and established. So it remains for me just to thank both Niamh for coming in today, and also for Thia for really a brilliant discussion. As I said, lots to think about, lots to look ahead to, and thank you all for listening. And we would just say keep an eye on the regulator's website, and indeed our website. We'll be monitoring the website, the regulator's website as well, and reporting on any developments. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.